Every morning, 77-year-old James Wilson quietly bought breakfast for a homeless pregnant woman outside Frankie's diner. No one knew his past until that Tuesday when 4 black military SUVs suddenly pulled up, changing everything in this small Kansas town. James Wilson moved through life with the quiet discipline only decades of military service could instill. At 77, the retired black Marine Corps medic still maintained his ramrod-straight posture despite the arthritis that sometimes made his morning walks to Frankie's diner painful. Each day for the past 3 years, he'd occupy the same corner booth, order the same black coffee and wheat toast, and speak only when necessary. The locals knew little about him, just that he lived alone in a modest apartment 2 blocks from the diner, that he always wore his faded Marine Corps veteran cap, and that his dark hands occasionally trembled when holding his coffee cup. What they didn't know was that those hands had once saved countless lives on blood-soaked Korean battlefields. They didn't know about the Purple Heart medal kept in a drawer by his bed, or how he still woke, sometimes hearing the cries of wounded men from a war fought half a century ago. James preferred it that way. He wasn't looking for recognition or gratitude. After losing his wife 5 years ago, the diner became his anchor, a place where the routine provided comfort in a world that had largely forgotten men like him. James first noticed Maria huddled in the alley beside Frankie's diner on a chilly October morning. She couldn't have been more than 25, her thin jacket stretched tight across her swollen belly, her possessions stuffed into a weathered backpack. While other customers hurried past, avoiding eye contact, James observed how she tucked herself against the wall, trying to become invisible. The next morning, he arrived earlier than usual and watched through the window as she woke, her breath visible in the cold air. Without hesitation, James ordered 2 breakfasts, his usual toast and a full plate of eggs, pancakes, and bacon. "Could you box one of these up?" he asked Doris, the waitress who'd served him for years. When Doris returned with a container, James added a bottle of orange juice and a banana from the counter display, paid for everything, and quietly walked outside. "Ma'am," he said, keeping a respectful distance, "thought you might be hungry." The young woman's eyes, wary at first, softened as she realized there were no strings attached to this offer. She introduced herself as Maria and explained she'd been living in her car until it was repossessed last week. "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice barely audible. James nodded and returned to his booth. The next day, without discussion, he repeated his act of kindness. By the end of the week, it had become their unspoken routine. By the 3rd week, Frank Martinez, the diner's owner, had noticed James's daily ritual. Unlike Doris, who discreetly prepared Maria's meals with extra portions, Frank saw only potential problems. "You're attracting vagrants," Frank said one morning, approaching James's booth. "Bad for business." James looked up from his newspaper. "I pay for the food, Frank." "It's not about the money," Frank replied, loud enough for nearby customers to hear. "It's about the image. People don't come here to see homeless people hanging around." Several customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. James remained composed, his weathered face revealing nothing of the anger he felt. "That woman is pregnant and hungry," he said quietly. "Where I come from, we don't turn our backs on people who need help." Frank scoffed. "Where you come from? Korea was 50 years ago. This is my business now, not some military charity." The casual dismissal of his service stung, but James had endured worse. He simply reached for his wallet and placed extra cash on the table. "Add this to my tab," he said. The confrontation sparked divided reactions among the regulars. Some, like Harold Thompson, a retired postal worker, began leaving larger tips that they whispered should go toward the pregnant girl's meals. Others muttered their agreement with Frank, suggesting that James was enabling laziness and dependency. Through it all, James continued his routine, though he noticed Frank watching him with growing resentment, calculating the cost of compassion against his bottom line. The situation came to a head on a rainy Friday morning. Maria, now visibly more pregnant and looking increasingly unwell, was sitting in her usual spot outside when James arrived. Before he could order her breakfast, Frank intercepted him at the counter. "Price went up," Frank announced, pointing to a hastily written sign. "Special orders are now double." James looked at the menu board where breakfast prices remained unchanged. Only for me? Special circumstances require special pricing, Frank replied with a smirk. Unless you prefer she find somewhere else to loiter? Several customers were watching now. James felt the weight of their gazes, but kept his dignity intact. A skill learned through decades of facing discrimination with military discipline. That's fine, James replied evenly, pulling out his wallet. Frank wasn't finished. You know, I've been thinking. All these years you talk about being a Marine medic, saving lives in Korea. He leaned closer. Convenient stories to get sympathy while you waste your pension on strays. The diner fell silent. James's hand paused midair, his eyes meeting Frank's challenge. For a moment, the old warrior's gaze hardened, and those who knew military men recognized the look of a man who had faced death and was intimidated by petty cruelty. My money still spends, Frank, James finally said, placing double the usual amount on the counter. And my conscience sleeps better for it. The following Monday, Frank's hostility escalated to public humiliation. As James placed his regular order, Frank loudly announced to the entire diner, "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to meet our local hero." His voice dripped with sarcasm. Claims he was some kind of battlefield angel in Korea, saving lives left and right. Now he's saving pregnant homeless women with my food. Customers turned to stare. Some looked embarrassed, others curious. James sat motionless, his coffee untouched. "Tell us, Wilson," Frank continued, "was it before or after they segregated the military that you became such a decorated hero? Because it seems to me a real hero wouldn't need to buy friends with free handouts." An older woman gasped. Two men at the counter looked down, uncomfortable with the scene unfolding. James had faced artillery fire with less anxiety than he felt now, with all eyes on him. But decades of military discipline held firm. He wouldn't engage in this battle on Frank's terms. "I'm just trying to have my breakfast, Frank," he said quietly. "Well, maybe you should have it somewhere else," Frank replied. "And tell your homeless girlfriend she's no longer welcome on my property. Next time I see her, I'm calling the police." James slowly stood, his arthritic joints protesting. At his full height, the old Marine still commanded presence. He placed money on the table, enough to cover his untouched meal. "I fought for this country, so people like you could say things like that to people like me," he said, his voice low but clear. "That doesn't make it right." With that, he walked out with a dignity that had carried him through war and 77 years of life. James had just reached the corner when he heard a cry from the alley. He found Maria doubled over in pain, her face contorted. "I don't feel right," she gasped, clutching her stomach. "Something's wrong." James's medical training, dormant for decades, instantly resurfaced. He helped her to a seated position against the wall, noting her rapid pulse and clammy skin. "How far along are you?" he asked, his voice calm and professional. 7 months, she winced. "But the baby's been kicking less since yesterday." James recognized the signs of potential complications. "We need to get you to a hospital," he said, reaching for his old flip phone. At that moment, Frank appeared at the alley entrance. "I told you she can't stay here. This woman needs medical attention," James replied firmly. "Call an ambulance." Frank crossed his arms. "Not my problem. Not my responsibility. Get her off my property now, or I'm calling the police instead." Several customers had gathered behind Frank, drawn by the commotion. One woman stepped forward. "Frank, she's clearly in distress." "Stay out of this," Frank snapped. "This isn't charity or a hospital." James made a swift decision. He dialed not 911, but a number few knew he had. "Captain Reynolds?" "James Wilson. I need a favor." His voice shifted subtly, taking on the crisp tone of command that had never fully left him. "Medical emergency at Frankie's Diner on Oak Street. Pregnant woman, possible prenatal complications." He listened briefly. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." Hanging up, James turned his attention back to Maria, checking her vitals with practiced movements. To the onlookers, it was suddenly apparent that this elderly man knew exactly what he was doing, his hands steady now, his assessment methodical. "Help is coming," he assured her, before looking up at the gathered crowd. I need clean towels and water. No one moved until Doris pushed through. I'll get them, she said, hurrying back into the diner. Frank sneered. Playing doctor now? This isn't some battlefield, old man. No, James replied calmly. On battlefields, most people try to help each other. 15 minutes later, the distinctive rumble of heavy vehicles drew everyone's attention. Four black military SUVs with government plates pulled up in perfect formation outside the diner. The crowd that had gathered parted as uniformed Marines emerged. Two medics rushing immediately to Maria's side with professional equipment and efficiency. Following them was a tall black man in his 50s wearing the insignia of a Marine Corps colonel. His presence commanded immediate attention as he surveyed the scene, his eyes quickly finding James. Master Sergeant Wilson, he called, approaching with respect evident in his bearing. James straightened instinctively, decades of military protocol overriding his physical discomfort. Colonel Richardson, he acknowledged with a slight nod. Frank watched in confusion as the colonel stood at attention and rendered a sharp salute to the elderly man he'd been mocking minutes earlier. It's an honor, Sergeant. My father served under your command in Korea. You saved his life at Chosin Reservoir. The colonel turned to address the stunned onlookers. For those who don't know, you're in the presence of Master Sergeant James Wilson, one of the most decorated combat medics in Marine Corps history. He gestured to two Marines, who retrieved a framed shadow box from one of the vehicles and held it up for all to see. Inside was a Purple Heart, a Silver Star, and various other medals. Sergeant Wilson treated over 200 Marines during the Battle of Chosin Reservoir, working for 38 straight hours in sub-zero temperatures. When their position was overrun, he carried 3 wounded men through enemy lines to safety. The colonel's voice filled with emotion. He became known as the Angel of Chosin among the men of the 1st Marine Division. My father was one of those men. Frank's face drained of color as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. The customers who had witnessed his treatment of James looked equally mortified. The Marine Corps takes care of its own, Sergeant, the colonel continued. And we certainly take care of the heroes who took care of us. The military medics worked efficiently, stabilizing Maria and preparing her for transport. One of them approached Colonel Richardson. Sir, she needs prenatal care immediately. Blood pressure is elevated, and there are signs of possible preeclampsia. The colonel nodded. Transport her to Memorial Hospital. I've already called ahead. They're expecting her. He turned to James. We'll ensure she receives the best care, Sergeant. James nodded gratefully, still maintaining his composure despite the dramatic turn of events. Frank, seeing his diner now effectively commandeered by the Marine Corps, attempted to reassert control. Look, I didn't know who he was, but this is still my business, and... Colonel Richardson cut him off with a look that had made hardened Marines stand down. Mr. Martinez, I understand this is your establishment. However, I'm rather concerned about what I've witnessed here today. He gestured towards several Marines who were now speaking with customers, collecting statements, denying assistance to a woman in medical distress, discriminating against a decorated veteran. These are serious matters. Richardson's voice remained professional but carried undeniable authority. The Marine Corps Times would be very interested in how a business treats one of our most distinguished veterans. So with the local media, I imagine... Frank paled further. I didn't mean any disrespect to Corps. It's not just about the Corps, Richardson interrupted. It's about basic human dignity, something Sergeant Wilson exemplified in war and continues to demonstrate in peace. Several customers nodded in agreement, some looking ashamed of their own silence during Frank's earlier behavior. I think, Richardson continued, this would be an excellent opportunity to reconsider how your establishment treats all its patrons, especially those who might need a little extra compassion. Within days, the story of James Wilson, the Angel of Chosin, spread throughout the community and beyond. The local newspaper ran a front-page article about his service record and his recent encounter at the diner. Veterans from across the state began making pilgrimages to meet him. Maria received comprehensive medical care at the hospital, where it was discovered she had preeclampsia that could have threatened both her and her baby's lives if left untreated. The Marine Corps Veterans Association established a support fund for her and her unborn child, ensuring she would have stable housing and resources. Frank's diner underwent a transformation as well. After a very public apology, Frank instituted a new policy, a suspended meal program where customers could prepay for meals that would be available to anyone in need. A framed photograph of a young James Wilson in his Marine uniform appeared on the Wall of Heroes by the entrance. James himself remained unchanged by the attention. He still occupied his corner booth each morning, still ordered the same black coffee and wheat toast. The only difference was that now, occasionally, young Marines in uniform would stop by his table, standing at attention until he gestured for them to sit down. What happened at Frankie's Diner sparked conversations throughout the community about how society treats its veterans, especially aging black veterans whose sacrifices had often gone unrecognized. Local schools began inviting veterans to speak about their experiences, with James reluctantly agreeing to visit once a month. The incident also highlighted the invisible struggles of homeless pregnant women, leading to increased support for the local women's shelter. Community members who had witnessed the confrontation found themselves examining their own tendencies to judge others based on appearance or circumstance. Perhaps most significantly, the story challenged perceptions about age and usefulness. At 77, James Wilson had demonstrated that the values instilled during military service, duty, compassion, and moral courage, never expired. His quiet daily act of kindness, performed without expectation of recognition or reward, had ultimately created ripples that transformed an entire community's understanding of heroism. Heroes walk among us every day, often unrecognized until moments of crisis reveal their true character. Has someone's unexpected heroism ever touched your life? Share your story below and subscribe for more incredible tales of courage and compassion.